Okay, hello everybody. Today's talk will be from Nazareth to Magdala. Now we scratched out Capernaum because of course Jesus's route was from Nazareth to Magdala to Capernaum, but his first stop, I would say for sure, when he reached the Sea of Galilee would have been Magdala. We'll understand why. So we're going to follow the route of Jesus from Nazareth, or touch Nazareth to get an idea, because there's some interesting little anecdotes on the way, but lead us down to Magdala, because it's a site that I would say that many of you who have visited Israel more than 5 years ago might not have visited. And as you can see in the small lettering, it says, where you can literally stand where Jesus stood. When I take groups around, they ask me, was Jesus here? Was Jesus here? Was Jesus here? Was Jesus here? Is this the right location? Is this not the right location? The one place you can literally point on 2 square meters and say, at this place, beyond doubt, Jesus stood. And the funny thing is, it's not exactly mentioned in the New Testament. We'll understand it a little bit better as we go on. So, Jesus of Nazareth, we can see that what's known as the synagogue church. It's a Greek Catholic church, which is said to be, which is not for sure, the location of the synagogue that Jesus was in Nazareth. And we read in Mark 6, Jesus stands up and speaks. We talked about this in the last lecture. Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, Josie, and Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? Of course, women did not have names, so they were offended at him. But Jesus said, a prophet is not without honor in his own country, amongst his own relatives, in his own house, etc. In Matthew, we have a similar story, but it's a little bit different. It says like this. He came into his hometown and began to teach the people in their synagogue. So they were astounded and said, where did this man get this wisdom and these deeds of power? And again, we dealt with that in much more depth last week. Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And are not his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? And are not all of his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all this? And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, prophets are not without honor, except in their own country and in their own house. And he did not do many deeds of power there because of their unbelief. These are the 2 stories that we usually don't read. The story that usually is dealt with is the story of Luke, because it's slightly different. In the story of Luke, we're told this. And he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and as his custom, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up and read. And there was delivered unto him the book of the prophet Isaiah, and when he opened the book, he found the place where it was written, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he hath anointed me. We will continue. And then he closed the book and he gave it to the minister. Again, terrible translation. There were no ministers. There also weren't rabbis as we know it today. Rabbi was a totally different position. The Hebrew word is Gabbai, who was the person who was in charge of the synagogue, and sat down, and the eyes of all them that were in the synagogue were fastened on him. And then it says, after he rolled up the scroll, he returned it to the attendant, the person who was in charge, and he sat down. Now, we know from the book of Acts, as we read, for Moses has had throughout many generations those who preach him in every city, being read in the synagogue every Sabbath. That was Jesus, and we'll understand how that comes to play a part when we reach Magdala. Now, Jesus, according to Luke, something else happens. And all they in the synagogue, when they heard these things, his interpretation, he filled with wrath and rose up and thrust him out of the city and led him onto the brow of the hill whereon the city was built, that they might cast him down headlong. So they chased him out of the city to a hilltop, but he passed through the midst of them, went his way. Now, what is traditional is that this is the location, the Mount of the Leap or the Mount of the Precipice, which is, and you see the beautiful, beautiful view into the Jezreel Valley. Over here, we see Mount Tabor. Here we see what is known as Givat HaMoreh. Over here is Nain, the place of the place where Jesus brought back to life the widow's son. And of course, right next to here is Shunem, same story with the prophet Elisha. Now, this is the traditional place. It has three names: the Mount of the Leap, the Brow of the Hill, the Mount of the Precipice. Now, this is the traditional location. Now, from there, he went down to Capernaum, a city in the Galilee, and taught them on the Sabbath days, similar to what we read in the book of Acts. In Judges chapter 5, we read about this area, again, when they're talking about the battle of Deborah, and it says, the river of Kishon swept them away, the ancient river, the river Kishon, and my soul thou hast trodden down strength. Again, this is from the song of Deborah. In Hebrew, it says, Nachal Kishon Girafam, Nachal Kidumim, because another name in Hebrew is Mount Kidumim, or the ancient mountain. Now, ancient is the translation of the word kadum, but the river, if there's a river, there's a mountain, so very possibly this was known as the ancient mountain, which is very interesting. We'll understand why in a minute. Again, the beautiful view of Jezreel Valley down beneath us. And here we can see, we don't have to hear, the story of Jesus standing there. And this, it's in Swedish. This is a public film, so it can be downloaded. But here we have Jesus being chased out of the city. He's chased out. They reach the hill. Again, this is not the original depiction, but it's quite well done. And here we see Jesus walks through them and leaves. Why is this important? Because here we have please forgive the terrible English and the amazing spelling mistakes that should never have taken place. But the Leaping Mountain, rising above the southern part of Nazareth, Mount Precipice, which is 397 meters tall, look out over Nazareth. It looks out over Nazareth, Mount Tabor, and the Jezreel Valley. It is also known as the Leaping Mountain, according to old tradition. Now, it's interesting, the tradition which was passed down from generation to generations, but it's hard to find the original source of it. But it was something for 1,500 years, people believed it. Jesus jumped from this mountain all the way down into the valley. He didn't walk between them, but that's just the tradition that was preserved there. That's why it's called the Leaping Mountain. Now, at the foot of the mountain is which is the really the Kfitza cave, where the Neolithic remains were found. In other words, from 10,000 years ago, and remains from 100,000 years ago were found. Very interesting. Not going to get into it, but a meeting place between the Neolithic person and the Homo sapien, maybe the Homo erectus. Here we can see the amazing caves that were found there. Here we find an interesting burial cave, which has an awful lot of meaning because the skeleton was buried in a fetal position. Traditionally, when somebody's buried in a fetal position, that means that the people burying them believe in rebirth because the person will rise up again, will be born again. Here we can see 100,000-year-old skeleton. Now, this is the hill. This is taken from the top of Nazareth. Now, how Jews would have escaped down there and climbed up the hill makes very little sense. That's why most likely Jesus would have escaped the town from where this picture is taken and not from where that traditional hill is. That didn't prevent the Pope from holding a huge mass when he came here not long ago, and an amazing church which is called the Church of Our Lady of Fear. In other words, this is where Mary saw Jesus leap according to that tradition. She was so scared. The church has just been redone not that long ago. Now, if Jesus would have hooked up to Google Maps in those days, he would have been given 3 routes to go from Nazareth down to Capernaum. The longer route, going alongside Sipori, and he would have gone down, reached Capernaum, not far from where Kibbutz Ginosar is today, where the boat was found, and then head up to Capernaum. The route he most likely took was probably the shortest route. If he would have gone down from the mountain of Leap, he would have headed down this way, though most likely he went down from the other side through what is today called Kfar Kana, is not the historical Kana where the miracle of the wine and the water took place, and headed down to this location. We'll see, we'll get a better idea of it in a minute. This is where Magdala is located. Here we can see the most likely route that he took down here, down this amazing valley, leads us right to Magdala. Now, why would he arrive at Magdala? Because that's the first location he reaches after probably a 2-day hike, and he winds up the first place he can get food, fresh water, and a substantial Jewish community. Here we can see the hill he walked by, the hill of Arbel, which is also from this direction, more or less, water was supplied to Magdala. We'll talk about that later, but there's an amazing cliff, and you walk down in the valley below it, and you reach the Sea of Galilee, which we can see below it. Now, we're told the story of Magdala and first of the Arbel. We're told by Josephus in the Antiquities of the Jews, and he says, but Herod, and then he went into the Galilee to take certain places which were held by garrisons of Antigonus. As he passed on to Sepphoris, or Tzipori that we talked about last week, as God sent a snow, which is rare in this area. The Arbel is, because again, keep in mind, the Sea of Galilee is over 200 meters below sea level. So even though this looks like an amazing cliff, it's not much above sea level. So while Antigonus's garrisons withdrew themselves and had plenty of provisions, he also went thence and resolved to destroy those robbers that dwelt in the caves. We'll see the caves in a minute, and did much mischief in the country. They were very near to a village called Arbela. Here is the Arbel. And on the 40th day after he came himself with the whole army. Now, these caves in the mountains were exceedingly abrupt, and in the middle were no other precipices. Again, interesting use of the word again, which certain entrances into the caves. Those caves were encompassed with sharp rocks, and in these caves did robbers lie concealed with all their families about them, because they were the only ones who knew how to get there. Now, in reality, the people that hid in those caves were the people revolting against the Romans in those days, but the king caused certain chests to be made in order to destroy them. Now, this is more or less what it looked like. Now, why is this story important? Because when Herod did this, he gained the trust of the Romans. And from that day on, he was fully trusted by the Romans in those days. Here we can see the caves, amazing, amazing caves. You can see this person here today. They are accessible. In those days, only people who really knew how to get along and mountain goats were able to reach there. Here we can see the cliff of the Arbel, beautiful green. So we're talking about probably in February, March. And here you can see the path running through the valley below the Arbel that Jesus would have gone on to reach the Sea of Galilee. Magdala is just around this picture of the cliff. once again, the pathway that Jesus would have followed. And again, if he would have had a bicycle, it would have been much easier for him. Now, at the very bottom here, we reach Magdala, which Jesus would have reached also. One of its Greek name was Tarichea, which means the place where they would salt fish. And we'll talk a bit about that. Now, we're told in the Jewish sources, Rabbi Abahu said that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish was a very interesting man because he was a gladiator who turned into a rabbi. According to the sages, leavening occurs in the time it takes for a person to walk the distance between Migdal Nunya. Migdal in Hebrew is a tower, Nunya is a fish. Now, if you think of somebody in the Bible whose name was Nun, that was Yehoshua ben Nun, Joshua, who led the children into Israel. A different talk, we might talk about that. The connection between Joshua, same name where Jesus' name Yeshua comes from, Ben Nun, the son of Nun, and Jesus' connection to Nun, Joshua leading the children of Israel into the land of Israel, to the physical land, and according to the Christian tradition, Jesus leading his people, the new Israel, as is defined in the New Testament, into the kingdom of heaven. So from Migdal Nunya to Tiberias, from here to Tiberias, which is to the south of us, which is a meal, 2,000 cubits, more or less a mile as we know it today. So we have the distance and it gives us the location. Now this all comes from the Babylonian Talmud written in the 5th century. And then the Gemara asks of this formulation, why is it necessary to mention the distance between the two places? Why do I care? Let us say that leavening begins after the time of a person to walk a meal or to walk a mile. The Gemara answers, this statement incidentally teaches us the length of a meal is the distance between Migdal Nunya, one of the Hebrew names or the Aramaic names really for Magdala or for Tarichea, and Tiberias. That gives us an exact location, which is right here. Now, we're also told in a very interesting source, which is the Jerusalem Talmud, and it tells us this. 3 cities had their tax books brought to Jerusalem on a carriage. What the rabbis are trying to tell us, they were extremely, extremely wealthy. They were so wealthy that the tax books that they came to present in Jerusalem to the Romans needed a carriage to carry them. Kabul, Sichrin, and Migdal Tzviya. Migdal Tzviya, another name for Magdala. Migdal, here it says Migdol, but which means a tower of where dyeing took place. Dyeing and painting of garments. All 3 were destroyed. Kabul due to conflicts, Sichrin due to magic, and Migdal Tzviya due to prostitution. I brought this purposely because we're going to talk about the link of Mary Magdalena and how she was linked later on to the element of prostitution. Did the Pope know that when he decided to spread the rumor? We don't know. But it's interesting that there is a connection between Magdala and the Jewish sources and prostitution, even though we will see very soon there really is no connection between Mary Magdalena and prostitution. Now, Magdala is destroyed. Here we can see an amazing mosaic. We'll get to see it closer up. That was found in Magdala of a boat. We'll see how it's almost identical. Again, 15 years after the death of Jesus, this mosaic was probably made. And once again, Josephus tells us, now this revolt of theirs was presently known at Tarichea. And there's Josephus, because he tells the story himself, because he was the commander of the Jewish forces at the time before he changed sides, had sent out all the soldiers that were with him to gather corn. He knew not how either to march out alone against the revolters or to stay where he was, because he was afraid the king's soldiers might prevent him if he tarried and might get into the city. For he did not, because again, we now know that Magdala was a major city. It was surrounded by a wall. And he did not intend to do anything on the next day because it was the Sabbath day and would hinder his proceedings. So he contrived to circumvent the revolters by this is the writing. Okay, so but the bottom line, which is the important thing, is the bottom three, from here, which were found to be 230 boats. In other words, a humongous port. Clearly, the largest port that existed on the Sea of Galilee was located here in Migdal. This is a better picture of the mosaic. It's interesting. Here we have a dolphin, not a fish, which is interesting, which again, we can analyze the mosaic, but here the fantastic depiction of the boat, which you can see what is known as the Jesus boat found on the kibbutz of Ginosar. Very, very similar, same concept of the mast, would have worked the same way. So that's just a comment of the port. Here we have the Battle of Magdala. This is when the Romans are defeating the Jews. Here you can see a depiction of the Battle of Magdala. Some of you might notice that this is taking place in Ethiopia and not in Israel. This is the famous British Battle of Magdala in 1868, but it gives a nice idea and concept that has nothing to do with the actual Battle of Magdala that Josephus tells us about. Josephus tells us in the Wars of the Jews, he says, Vespasianos, when his rafts were ready, put on board as many troops as he considered necessary to cope with the fugitives on the lake and launch his flotilla. The Jews, thus rounded up, could neither escape to land, because they were surrounded, where all were in arms against them, nor sustain a naval combat on equal terms, because the Romans had warships that the Jews had fishing ships and maybe transport ships. For their skiffs being small and built for piracy, don't know how accurate that is, but we'll let that go, were no match for the rafts, and each was manned by no more than a handful of men. Again, because usually we would say a maximum number of 10 people could get on the fisherman's boat, who were afraid to close with the dense ranks of the Roman assailants. If they tried to break through the line, the Romans could reach them with their lances, and we'll go on. Now, the final result was, according to Josephus, we can read, he mentions that 40,000 people were killed. There weren't 40,000 people in Magdala. And again, Josephus is a brilliant historian, not a brilliant mathematician, but one could see the whole lake red with blood, covered with corpses, for no man escaped. So in the year 68, Magdala was destroyed. Now, in the New Testament, the main connection of Magdala is to Mary Magdalena. In Luke 8, we read, "And it came to pass afterwards that he went through every city and village, preaching and shewing the glad tidings of the kingdom of God, and the 12 were with him." This is after he already had his 12 disciples. "And a certain woman who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities, Mary called Magdalena, out of whom went 7 devils. And Joanna, the wife of Chuza Herod's steward, and Susanna, and many others, which ministered unto him of their substance." Now, in other words, we're talking about the 3 women that are mentioned. We mentioned before, Jesus' sisters were not mentioned because women usually are not mentioned, but wealthy women that people would recognize their names who helped Jesus out were mentioned. And here we have Mary called Magdalena. Her name in Hebrew is Miriam HaMigdalit. In other words, Mary or Miriam, who comes from Migdal, which is Magdala. And that's where her name comes from, just like we have Judah Iscariot, really Judah Ish Krayot, because he came from a place known as the Krayot, and very frequently people were named after the location they came from. So, but what do we know from here? We know the story of the 7 devils being removed. In Hebrew, in the Jewish tradition, 7 is a complete number, so she was completely overtaken. That's probably the meaning of the text. Completely overtaken by the devils, and she was a wealthy woman. And we talked about Migdal being a location of major wealth, a major city. In Mark 16, we read this, and when the Sabbath was passed, now again, remember, always Jesus will strive to talk and read the scripture and interpret it in the synagogue on the Sabbath. Mary Magdalena, Mary the mother of James, and Salome had brought sweet spices. Another talk we can talk about, is there a connection? There's a Jewish tradition that you have an extra soul on the Sabbath and you sniff spices because as a way that extra soul leaves you. So that was probably a tradition that existed already in that day. It's done till today in the Jewish tradition, that they might come and anoint him. Now, when Jesus was risen early, the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalena, out of whom he had cast 7 devils. Okay, so we have the 3 women who come to Jesus, who come to the tomb, and then bringing it, and he had appeared to Mary Magdalena. And they, now we're going on to Mark, and they that had eaten were 4,000. This is the story of the feeding of the 4,000, and he sent them away. Where did he go? And straightway he entered into a ship with his disciples and came to the parts of Dalamanutha. What is Dalamanutha? Matthew tells the same story of the 4,000 people ate, and he went away, the multitude, and took a ship and came to the coast of Magdala. So this might be an additional name of Magdala. Magdala would be the port where anybody would want to dock. Now, we mentioned Mary before, because Mary was bad-mouthed by the church over the years. Here you can see a wonderful mosaic in the current church in Magdala that we'll visit in just a couple of minutes, which is slightly different. Because here you can see a nice lady, not touching, but some closeness between them. We can see Mount Arbel behind us and the village of Magdala as it is depicted in this. Luke chapter 7, we're told, and one of the Pharisees desired him that he would eat with them. And he went into the Pharisee's house and sat down to meat. Again, it's an important thing because meat is not a traditional food that would usually be served. And behold, a woman of the city, which was a sinner, which she knew that Jesus sat down at meat in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster box of anointment. Again, remember. Now, that's the sinning woman. Now, we know Mary had devils in her. She was once said to be a sinning. Now, the Pope says this, she whom Luke calls the sinful woman, whom John calls Mary, we believe to be Mary, from whom 7 devils were ejected according to Mark. What did these 7 devils signify? If not all the vices. She was pure bad. It is clear, I don't know how you could say it is clear, that the woman previously used the unguent to perfume her flesh in forbidden acts. Aha, the box of alabaster was used previously for perfume. What she therefore displayed more scandalously, she was now offering to God in a more praiseworthy manner. She had coveted with earthly eyes, but now through penitence, these are consumed with tears. She displayed her hair to set off her face. Because again, usually Mary will be displayed with red hair flowing at an exposed shoulder in most Catholic art. But now through penitence, these were consumed with tears. She displayed her hair to set off her face, but now her hair dries her tears. She had spoken proud things with her mouth, but in kissing the Lord's feet, she now planted her mouth on the Redeemer's feet. For every delight, therefore, she had in herself, she now immolated herself. She turned the mass of her crimes to virtues in order to serve God entirely in penitence. and that was Pope Gregory in the 6th century. So that's how the tradition, baseless, does not appear in the text. Interesting interpretation, an attempt to, and that's where Mary, many of you have heard the story of Mary being a harlot, but in reality, there's really no basis to that. Here we have an aerial picture of the huge harbor with amazing archaeological finds found around there, a bathhouse, public bathroom, major city, estimated maybe 12,000 people live there, clearly 230 boats at the harbor. Here, a Byzantine monastery was found. Here we have, here the synagogue we'll talk about, the new church we'll visit very soon, a fish market over here, a very wealthy residential area over here. So that gives you an idea. Here we can see a short film to get an idea. Again, talk about how where the tradition says the miracle of the 7 springs, the miracle of the fish, the miracle of the fish and the loaves. So here you can see the Sea of Galilee, the Mount of Beatitudes on top of the hill here, and the humongous port of Magdala. So we can see this whole area was all part of the historical Magdala that covered a gigantic area. That will give an idea. In this location here now we have, belongs to the Franciscan friars. There's both Franciscan and the Catholic Church of Mexico who control this area. Here's an ancient picture of Magdala over 100 years ago. Very little there. Here we can see remnants of the port of Magdala, which gives us a nice idea of what we can, of the excavations that took place there. Very wealthy public area. Here you can see more of it dug up from in an aerial view with a typical Roman city. You can see the roads running, the Cardo, the Decamanos, this public square. Here we can see where there is currently, as a matter of fact, the hotel has actually opened. We'll be visiting here in a minute. This is where the synagogue is, the fish market, the very wealthy. This whole area probably was a very, very wealthy community. The house of what's known as the House of Dice, which was a mansion with 15 rooms. Here we have the major church that was found there. Here we find a mosaic in Hebrew, postdates Jesus. Here we see some of the most beautiful Jewish ritual baths, known as the mikveh, were found here. They were so well built that they still hold water till today. Multiple mikvehs were found. These were all private mikvehs. In other words, the very wealthy people, there's even one house with 2. Here you can see the actual pipeline of water. It's an interesting discussion in Jewish law, whether that is permissible or not, but phenomenal 7 steps going down. Amazing ritual baths, again, even though it was a city already built in the Hellenistic period. The Romans arrived in the year 63 BC, but it was always populated with Jews. This is part of the fish market. These are actual pools where fish were sold. Here's one pool, here's another pool. People would come. So again, put yourself in Jesus's place. He just walked through a long walk in the sun all the way from Nazareth, very strenuous. He can either bathe in the water or even go to the Roman baths that were there. There was a Jewish city, there was no issue. So here we reach the backside of the spectacular church there. And even though it's not directly connected to the lecture, I'd like to visit it because there are a few little anecdotes that are really worth seeing. And then there are some New Testament verses that most likely did take place here, and we'll understand how. Here again, once again, the Arbel in the background and the backside of the church. In the basement of the church, they reconstructed quite similar to a traditional Jewish synagogue in the time of Jesus. Now, it has to be emphasized. In the time of Jesus, synagogues were used for study, for gathering, not for praying. Communal praying started much later. Beautiful piece of art on the wall. Most of you have probably figured it out. It is the bleeding woman touching the corner of Jesus's garment. They made a slight mistake here, and we'll understand it in a minute. And here that is And if you ever go there, please make a point to turn off the lights when you go in there, because beautifully done, the point she touches lights up. Natural, part of the amazing work of painting takes place there. Of course, in the Jewish synagogue, there would not have been an altar like this. We'll understand what there was very soon. Here we can get a wider view of both the painting and the synagogue. Nowadays, synagogues will always be oriented towards Jerusalem, or almost always. In those days, because the temple still existed, there was no need to have the orientation to Jerusalem, but yes, to remember Jerusalem, and that will be part of the pinnacle of today's talk. And we read, "And behold, a woman which was diseased with an issue of blood 12 years, came behind him and touched the hem of his garment." We'll understand what that was in 1 minute. "For she said within herself, if I may but touch his garment, I shall be whole." Now, because she's a bleeding woman in the Jewish tradition, that she's impure, so she could not touch Jesus, because then that would make him impure. But to touch the garment, and the side of the garment, which has a major element of sanctity, which we will see in a minute, we'll understand. But some people had an issue with this. "But Jesus turned him about, and when he saw her, he said, 'Daughter, be of good comfort, thy faith hath made thee whole,' and the woman was made whole from that hour, and she was cured." Now, in the book of Numbers, we read, "Speak unto the children of Israel, and bid them that they make fringes on the borders of their garments throughout their generations, and that they put upon the fringe of their borders of blue." We'll understand what that is in 1 minute. "And it shall be unto you for a fringe, that ye may look upon it and remember all the commandments of the Lord and do them, and they shall not seek after your own heart and your own eyes, which ye use and go whoring." So the fringes remind us that you have those fringes on you, and that way it reminds you of God's commandments. Now, the fringe comes in many times. In the story of David and Saul, David comes from behind and cuts off one of these hinges, which are known as tzitzit. Again, and then that makes Saul incomplete, because you need to have the 4 hinges. Same story with Saul chasing after Samuel, and the corner is torn away. It's a very prominent element, and every Jew in those days would have a garment that had 4 corners, but more like a poncho and not like the prayer shawl that we wear today. And that's a huge mistake, which is made all the time. Here we have a depiction of Jesus. Everybody in their prayer shawls did not exist in those days. Every per man would have a garment that had 4 corners on it, as I said, similar to a poncho, not a special prayer shawl with those hinges. And here we can see 2 types and 2 talitot, prayer shawls that are used today. One that has the blue as is the commandment, because the blue comes from a unique snail that exists in the Phoenicians were the experts on it. When that was that tight, how that was made was lost. So Jews would use just regular strings, and when that was rediscovered, many Jews now have that single blue string in their garment, and that is, so what the bleeding woman touched was the tzitzit at the corner of Jesus's clothing. So that's what it would have looked like. Here we're in the women's section of the church, which is dedicated to important women throughout history with the most phenomenal acoustics. And we enter and we see the church. Now, the fantastic thing is it faces the Sea of Galilee, and the altar is a boat. We'll understand why in just a minute. Here we can see the beautiful altar, and you have it's as if it's on marble that looks like water, with the water on the outside. Well, all of this is now filled up with water with the fantastic rains we have had. In Matthew 13, we read, "The same day when Jesus out of the house and sat by the seaside." A great multitudes were gathered together unto him, so that he went into a ship and sat, and the whole multitude stood on the shore. So again, the tradition of Jesus preaching from a boat, the mast being a cross, and in a way, remembering the story of Jesus preaching from a boat. Now here we have a short film of the various, we'll see some very interesting things in this film, just a very interesting, unique thing that exists in this church. Again, you have the 12 disciples as icons, classical Orthodox icons, which again, 15, 20 years ago could not have been, because you would not see icons in the Catholic Church. The first one we see is, whoa, sorry about that. The first one we see is Thomas with his hand, doubting Thomas. Each one of them has a very interesting attribute. We'll just cover them quickly because I find them very interesting. We have Judas Jacobi, who was killed with an axe. That's why his attribute is an axe. Andrew with the cross like an X. That's the Scottish flag, of course, because he was crucified with that. We're not going to get into, you see the saw. We're not going to get into how Simon traditionally was killed. Here we already have Matthew with the Bible, because again, his attribute is traditionally being one of the Gospels. John, the youngest, never shaven, again, also with the book, always the youngest of them all. Simon Peter with the scroll. And now we reach another person that we're not going to get in, which is Jacob. This is who was decapitated according to tradition. Once again, the beautiful altar with the cross as the staff. Here we have a little knife with Bartholomew, Nathaniel, because he was traditionally skinned alive. So once again, we don't have to cover them all, but here we'll stop for 1 minute, because this you will almost never see in a church. Here we have Judas. What differs Judas from all the other people depicted here? Again, his attribute being the bag of money, and of course he has no halo. On an artistic level, the others are known as icons. We'll talk a bit about icons in another talk. An icon is traditionally not painted, it is written. It's considered a holy scripture. A painting is painted, so Judas does not have a halo, and it is not an icon, it is a painting. But interestingly enough, you don't expect to see Judas in the church, but lo and behold, he made it. Again, crucified on a T, that's Philip. So here we have just an interesting idea. Now we get to what I was waiting for. I don't know about you. The synagogue, because the synagogue is a spectacular archaeological find. Why is it such an amazing find? One, this is a synagogue that existed in the time of Jesus. Jesus would come to every city, and when he would come to the city, he would preach. So we can say probably without doubt that Jesus would have preached in this synagogue. And the findings in the synagogue are spectacular. One, you can actually see. You can see the stones and the plaster that was on them. The mosaics are 15 years after the time of Jesus, but the plaster floors, the stones that were laid down, the seats, the pillars. We'll see some beautiful paint that was there. There's the fresco walls. This is a place you can say beyond doubt. Because again, as we saw the route, this would have been the first place he reached. And probably Mary would have been the first person, that's where he probably first met her. So, and it's a problem that existed within Christianity. What position would Mary have played, especially if she predated some of the disciples? Here we can see a very similar synagogue found in the city of Gamla, in what is today the Golan Heights. Slightly larger, which is interesting. We're not going to talk about why it's larger. Same idea. Seats that surround the area, a central court that is in the middle. This is what the synagogue in Magdala would have looked like. Here was a study room, a smaller room. This would have been the central room where people would have come to study, would sit around. And here you have somebody kneeling down. We'll understand why that's wrong. But once again, we get the idea of what was going on here. This is some fresca. This would have been the color of the synagogue that Jesus would have visited. This is what Jesus would have literally seen. Because people always say, what can I see that Jesus saw? Again, the first answer, of course, is always the stars. You look at the stars, identical to what would have been seen. 2, 3, what Jesus would have seen, what Abraham would have seen. Second, in many cases, the nature, very similar. But to actually see a physical building, which is identical, and to see the exact same colors that Jesus would have seen when he was preaching here, I think for most Christians would have been quite a fantastic thing to see. Same thing with the pillar that you saw bouncing in here, because in 363, Magdala was totally destroyed by an earthquake. Again, the plastered pillar, that's the same color. And again, because it's painted in a system which is called a fresca, which is plastering, and with the damp plaster painting with natural colors, the colors are sucked in and then are preserved. So the same colors that would have been seen 2,000 years ago. The mosaic with the Rosetta, the mosaic postdates Jesus. We know today for sure, around in the time of Agrippa, that's when the mosaic was laid. So here, and then in the center here, which we'll be dealing with very soon, we see a small stone, which is known as the Magdala Stone, which is considered by many one of the most important archaeological finds in the last 50 years. Here we can see the synagogue in its early times. Again, the pillar was positioned there, would not have been there, would have been 4 pillars here, the seats sitting around. And here we see the Magdala Stone. Again, it was not found in the center, and we saw the man kneeling down, but that was probably not the case. Most likely, there would have been a table positioned on top of it. And then on the table, the person would come and read from the 5 books of Moses, read from the prophets. And we'll understand how they came to this conclusion. Quite amazingly, some 10 years later, and another stone, which was found interesting in a secondary use, in what was a synagogue, not as decorative, not as spectacular, but most likely gives credibility to this explanation. Now we see the Magdala Stone. On the 2 long sides, we can see 3 arches. Now, there are many, many explanations. Some give a more simple explanation, some give a more, I would say, from my perspective, a more accurate one. The explanation that now what is this in the middle? There are 2 explanations that are given. Here we have 3 archways. Is this corn, is this sweet, or are these inner arches? Because we now know beyond doubt that there were 3 arches leading up to the temple in Jerusalem. These are much later ones, but this is where the entrance to the temple when you head up from the southern side. This is the depiction of the temple in the Israel Museum. Here there are only 2 arches, though today we know there were 3 arches that will be fixed sooner or later. Here we can see a depiction of what those inner arches would have looked like heading up to the temple. So it's probably the scene the pilgrim would see when they enter the main court of the temple. Now, we're having issues with our... Now, here we see the side, which is very interesting. These look like, again, Rosetta stones, but there's a big difference. There's a hole in the middle. So these look much more like wheels. Now, in Daniel 7, we read, I beheld till the throne were cast down, and the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair on his head like the pure wool. His throne was like the fiery flame, and the wheels, and his wheels as burning fire. Here we see underneath a depiction which is frequently used as fire and wheels above this. This, of course, is talking about God on his crown, on his throne. So is this an attempt to depict the Holy of Holies? Because you have to keep in mind, again, it's a mystical depiction, but it was very prevalent in certain elements in those days. Because you have to keep in mind, the Holy of Holies in the time of the Second Temple was empty. The Holy of Holies was empty because the Ark of the Covenant had been taken and captured by the Persians. And when it was captured, the Holy of Holies in the Second Temple was empty. So how do you have a depiction of what is there? Because God was defined in the Bible as Yoshev Kruvim, somebody who sits on the cherubs. So now we have the depiction from Daniel of him sitting on a chariot, the wheels and the fire underneath. Now, in the first book of Enoch, we have an additional description which gives even more. Now, Enoch, again, is a Jewish book that did not make it into the Bible, but it says this, and I saw therein a lofty throne. Its appearance was as crystal, and the wheels thereof as the shining sun. And from underneath the throne came streams of fire. So here we have fire, and once again, the wheels of the throne. But wheels are not just wheels. In Ezekiel, we once again understand how problematic translation is. Now, as I beheld the living creatures, behold, one wheel upon the earth by the living creature with four faces. How does a wheel a creature? And in verse 16, the appearance of the wheels and their work was like unto the color of the beryl, and they four had one likeness, and their appearance and their work was as it were a wheel in the middle of a wheel. Now the Hebrew, it says mar'eh ha'ofanim. An ofan in the Bible can be a wheel, but it also represents an angel. But it's a round angel that the tradition in those days was that those angels were the wheels of God's chariot. So here everything comes together. U'masehem ke'en tarshish u'dmut echad la'arbatam u'marehen u'masehem kasher yeh ha'ofan. Ofan, the single element, betoch ha'ofan, a wheel within a wheel. Now, interestingly enough, when Hebrew was brought back to life 100 and some odd years ago, there was no word for a bicycle. The word for a bicycle in Hebrew is ofanaim, which comes from ofan, a wheel, which comes from an angel, which is just interesting. 4th century BC in Israel, a coin was found, depiction of God sitting on a wheel with wings. So that concept of God sitting on a chariot or on a wheel, again, empty element in the middle, gives additional legitimacy. Here we see from Capernaum, 2 wheels carrying, it's a question what it is. Is this the temple? Is this the ark? Because in the Jewish tradition, in the early synagogues, there was no ark as there are in synagogues today. What there was a box that was rolled in. Might that represent God's Holy of Holy where he dwells with the wheels on it, or does it represent an ark being brought in? We'll let people decide. The third side that attracted the most attention was, of course, because of the menorah. We have the menorah, the candelabrum in the temple, and we have 2 amphora on either side, and it is sitting on a box. Now, important things to keep in mind. It's an attempt to depict the menorah as a tripod, because that's how it stood in those days. But what is the box it's standing on? The interpretation that's given that I think is probably the most accurate is that to get an idea here, there was also the golden, there was also the incense altar. The golden altar was here, which was behind the menorah, and that gives a depiction. What are these 2 amphoras? Well, let's read, and it says, "For who hath despised the day of small things? For they shall rejoice, and shall see the plummet in the hands of Zerubbabel with those seven. They are the eyes of the Lord, which run to and fro through the whole earth." Then answered and said unto him, "What are these two olive trees?" Olive trees? "On the right side of the candlestick, of the menorah, and upon the left side of it." Only problem is that the Hebrew word is bnei yitzhar, the sons of trees. Now, this is the product of olive trees. So that's probably the actual depiction of what we have there. Here we have the menorah in Titus's gate. And as you can see, the base is very different. But we know today beyond doubt that that came from a statue of some type that was put there in order to make it steadier. But here we have the menorah being brought, just as a side comment, which is interesting. In the Colosseum in Rome, there is a sign saying that the Colosseum was built with the loot taken from Jerusalem. Here we have a coin, a Jewish coin that on one side has the menorah. There are not many depictions of the menorah that have been found from the time of the temple. That's why the stone is so important. And on the other side is a table. Interestingly enough, in Titus's gate, we also have a table being brought back. What table was there in the temple? Of course, the table of the showbread. And here we have, there are different arguments. What exactly is this the showbread? But most would say this is the showbread. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 on the top of the table. You can see in the corner, you can see that there are round elements where the table would have been placed. So here we have the showbread on the table, on the very top of it, alongside the menorah and the golden altar. So we see a very interesting depiction here. We can see it a little bit better. The beautiful depiction, even though traditionally, here's an attempt to, and here we can see on the side, there are branches. Originally, those were said to be trees. The explanations given today is those were the brooms that were used once again in the temple to sweep up the ashes that were collected in the temple from the sacrifices, and the 4 round areas which were used for the table to stand on it. In the book of Leviticus, we're told, "And thou shalt take fine flour and bake 12 cakes thereof. 2/10 deals shall be in 1 cake, and thou shalt set them in 2 rows, 6 on 1 row, upon the pure table of the Lord." Now, were they in straight rows or were they 6 facing each other? That's the interesting explanation that gives a different viewing of how that was. And again, keep in mind, this was made by an artist who lived when the temple existed. So he very well might have seen what was in the temple. He for sure would have seen the menorah. "And thou shalt put pure frankincense upon each row, and it may be on the bread for a memorial, even an offering made by fire unto the Lord. Every Sabbath he shall set it in order. He shall set it in order before the Lord, continually being taken from the children of Israel by an everlasting covenant." And then we read about Solomon when he built the temple and made of vessels that pertained unto the house of the Lord, the altar of gold, the table of gold, whereupon the shewbread was. The loaves on the table, 12 in number. And in the book of Kings, we read, when Solomon completed building the temple, and Solomon made all the vessels that pertained unto the house of the Lord, the altar of gold, which we saw, the table of gold, whereupon the shewbread was. So again, similar to Solomon's temple, this is what we find in Magdala. Then in Josephus, he tells us the interesting element, the loaves on the table, 12 in number, the circle of the zodiac, and the year. So here we have Josephus describing the showbread exactly as we find it in Magdala. So everything comes together. An interesting little anecdote is that the showbread would come from the Galilee, from the area of Chorazin, which is one of the three cities that Jesus cursed, because that was the highest quality of wheat, very possibly brought by boat to Magdala, then taken to the far end of and then from there, taken and brought up to the temple. The final anecdote I want to deal with, here just one thing, we can see a very interesting depiction of the showbread as it's depicted in Tzipori that we talked about last week. The 12 loaves on the table, again, not in 2 rows, but in a different way. Now, the final anecdote I want to deal with is it's very possible that this depiction that we saw on the side will answer a question that we don't know, the depiction of the chariot. Here we have Jesus before the high priest. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, answer thou nothing. What is in it which these witnesses against thee? But he said, he held his peace and answered nothing. Again the high priest asked him and said unto him, art thou the Christ? Again, art thou the Messiah, would be the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am. And ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest rent his clothes and saith, what need we any further witness? Ye have heard the blasphemy. What think ye? And they all condemned him to be guilty of death. Now, we're not going to get into the whole problematic issue of the depiction of what happened here, because the Sanhedrin could not sentence Jesus to death. If the Last Supper, which we'll deal with in a future lecture, was on the eve of Passover, then the Sanhedrin would not have met. But the question that is problematic is, what did Jesus say that was blasphemy? Because somebody who was anointed, many people were anointed. Every priest was anointed in those days. Son of the Blessed? Now, there's nothing that is, because again, the concept of somebody who is son of God, Ata ben Adam, you the son of Adam, or so what was blasphemous here? If we go back to where we just were, in the book of Psalms we read, who layeth the beams of his chambers in the water. That's talking about God. Who maketh the clouds his chariot, the clouds of heaven, and his chariot, who walketh upon the wings of the wind. So let's go back to our Nazareth stone, and then we can suddenly understand that if it is interpreted, if the interpretation of this side is the Holy of Holies, which is interpreted as a chariot and where God sits, then suddenly what Jesus said here could be seen as blasphemy, because I am going to be sitting on God's chariot. Because just to interpret his things regularly, that could not be seen as blasphemy. But if we now understand from what was found in Magdala, the depiction of God's chariot as the Holy of Holies and where God sits, and Jesus says, I will be on those clouds, I will be on that chariot, that is where it can be seen as blasphemy. So Magdala has, this amazing discoveries of Magdala have given us an awful lot. One, it is, as I said before, for any Christian pilgrim to be able to stand and see literally the physicality that Jesus saw is spectacular. You can stand in the same place, and it also helps us much better understand many of the writings that are told, because that's why the first stop was for sure Magdala. I would dare say, so the first person who hooked up to Jesus and agreed to support him was Mary Magdalena. Then he continued on to his new home in Capernaum, but after receiving and teaching and preaching in Magdala. So I hope you've enjoyed the lecture, and we will meet again soon. Thank you.